Welcome to part 2 of the Year 10 Science revision screencast for genetics and evolution. Before I move on to talk about showing different types of alleles and pedigrees, I want to clarify a couple of things to do with Punnett squares. One of these is that you can be expected to do Punnett squares in a number of different ways. So you can be expected to do a Punnett square both for autosomal inheritance and also for sex-linked inheritance. But you also may end up with questions both that give you what the genotypes of the parents are and then ask you to work out a Punnett square. Equally, you might be given a phenotypic ratio like this one down here, and from that asked to work backwards to work out what the possible parents are. So you can see here that we've got a phenotypic ratio of 3 green arms to 1 white arms, and that corresponds with these two heterozygous parents here. A different phenotype ratio would correspond to different combinations. For example, if you had capital G with capital R, little r, you'd end up with a 100% green arms phenotype at the end. Whereas if you had a capital G, little g, crossed with a little g individual, that would correspond to a 50% to 50% ratio of the two different phenotypes that are available. So you can be expected to work backwards as well as forward with these sorts of Punnett squares. So let's discuss the different options of how you show genotypes and how you show alleles when you're doing a Punnett square. So first of all, if we're talking about an autosomal characteristic, you show the dominant allele with a capital letter. In this example here, capital G. Recessive allele you show with the lowercase letter, in this case lowercase g. Now apologies for changing letter here, but you'll get the idea. So you have 3 possible genotypes. 2 of the capital letter, which is homozygous dominant, capital followed by lowercase, which is our heterozygous, and lowercase followed by lowercase, which is our homozygous recessive. Sex-linked alleles are similar, but rather than just having the letter for the allele, we also put the letter X to show that this allele is attached to the X chromosome. It's a section of DNA on the X chromosome itself. So a dominant allele we would show as X with a superscript letter capital N up the top, and a recessive allele we would show as X with a lowercase letter up the top right. So what this means for sex-linked alleles is that there's 5 different types of possible genotypes. So we can have X capital N, X capital N, X capital N, X little n, and X little n, X little n. All of those 3 individuals will be female, but their phenotypes may differ. And there's 2 possible genotypes for males, X capital N, Y, and X little n, Y, respectively. It's important to note here that if we were talking, for example, about an X-linked recessive condition, so this is a condition that only shows up if you don't have the dominant allele. If we were talking about an X-linked recessive condition, then there are 2 individuals out of these 5 genotypes that would show the disorder. So this female here, who has 2 copies of the affected recessive allele, so is homozygous recessive, would show the disorder, as would this male here. This male only has 1 copy of the damaged recessive allele, but because he has the Y chromosome as his second sex chromosome, he unfortunately is not able to have a backup dominant allele to protect him. So when we're talking about an X-linked recessive condition, that's why males are much more likely to be affected than females, because it's possible for a female to carry the disorder by having 1 of the affected alleles and 1 of the normal healthy alleles, such that this individual here, where my cursor is, would be able to pass the condition on to her children, but would not show it herself. So we call her a carrier female. So, just briefly going to mention a couple of pedigrees here. Pedigrees are important for a couple of reasons. They can show us 2 different things. First of all, they can show us whether a disease is dominant or whether it's recessive. and they can show us whether it is autosomal or sex-linked. A couple of hints in trying to work that out. If the disorder, which is coded for by the coloured in black individuals, if that disorder is present in every generation, it's most likely that the disorder is dominant. If you see a situation where there is an affected individual in generation 1, but they have children who do not have the disorder, and then in the third generation the disorder comes back, then it's guaranteed to be recessive. Because a dominant disorder, by its very nature, you only need one allele to show the dominant disorder, so it cannot skip a generation. So if you see a pedigree where a generation has been skipped, it's guaranteed to be recessive. Second hint here is in terms of trying to determine whether a disorder is linked to the X chromosome. If affected individuals are roughly equal males and females, then it's probably autosomal. If, on the most part, or if only, males are affected and all of their mothers are unaffected, you can be pretty safe in assuming that it's going to be an X-linked condition. Okay, that's everything for genetics for now. Use this as a guide to help you work through the genetics practice test if you so like. I'm going to move on now to starting some evolution revision. So our revision through evolution will be nice and quick and punchy. A few things that are important to discuss. First of all, I want to talk about variation. Okay, so variation is genetic differences between individuals in a population. And there's a couple of different ways that variation can show itself. Variation can be discrete, which means that it fits into predefined categories. For example, you can have cats that have long hair and cats that have short hair. Just like we would say that humans can have brown eyes or they can have blue eyes. That's a discrete variation in that you fit into one of those categories. The other possibility is continuous variation, where the characteristic can be any value between two extremes. The main example of this would be human height. So between the shortest individual who ever lived, who was about 61 centimeters tall, all the way through to the tallest individual who ever lived, who was about 270 centimeters tall, we can be any height between those two heights. We don't have to fit into either 150 or 160 or 170. We can be any value we like between those two extremes. And that's what we mean when we say continuous variation. It's important also to know the difference between variation and adaptation. So when we talk about a variation, we're talking about those genetic differences between individuals and the phenotypic differences in terms of the characteristics they show. So for example, is it a red beetle or a yellow beetle, or is it an orange beetle? An adaptation is specifically a variation that is favored by the environment. So this is a variation that gives an organism an advantage, a survival advantage in that particular environment. So with our beetles prac the other day, for example, the yellow beetles had a survival advantage and were not preyed on anywhere near as much as the red beetles were. So that was an example of an adaptation that allowed them to survive. Equally, we might discuss the peppered moths from the UK during the Industrial Revolution, where you had one possible variation where they had a white phenotype with black speckles. The other possible variation was a black coloured phenotype. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, there were predominantly white coloured bark on the trees, so the white phenotype was better able to camouflage itself. When pollution increased during the Industrial Revolution and there was more in the way of carbon and soot and pollution on the trees, which changed the colour of the bark, suddenly that meant that the black phenotype had more of an advantage. So that became an adaptation that was favoured by the environment. Second set of terms that you need to know well are species and speciation. So when we discuss a species, there's a very specific definition for this. And this is an organism that can reproduce sexually to create offspring that are both viable, which means they're able to survive, and fertile, so that they can reproduce as well. So if two organisms can reproduce and create offspring that are viable, so they live, however those offspring can't have children, this An example here would be the case of an offspring between a donkey and a horse, which is a mule. Now a mule obviously can survive, but a mule cannot reproduce. And because a mule can't reproduce, that tells us that donkeys and horses are separate species because they can't have offspring that are viable and fertile. Speciation is that specific process of two groups diverging, moving further and further apart, so that they actually can't reproduce together to form viable and fertile offspring. Now that can happen for a variety of reasons. It may happen because of geographic isolation. So, for example, two types of squirrels in the Grand Canyon in the USA. One trapped on the southern side of the canyon, one trapped on the northern side of the canyon when the canyon was formed millions of years ago. Because they've been geographically isolated from one another, they're no longer capable of reproducing together, and they've evolved separately and speciated to become two different species. We also talk about evolution by natural selection. And when we talk about evolution by natural selection, there's a specific set of processes that occur within that. First of all, for natural selection to actually happen in the first place, there has to be variation in a population. It's no good if every single beetle is coloured red, then they're all going to be preyed upon at the exact same rate, and so there'll be no change in the gene flow, no change in the proportions of genes in the population. There must be a difference in the first place. Secondly, we always tend to get an overproduction of offspring, so there tends to be more offspring produced than is required for the species to survive. So if you think about it with our beetles pack, we produced 15 offspring, which gave us 45 beetles in total, which was more than we actually needed because we could afford to lose a few of them to our nameless and pictureless predators, and the species would still survive. Then we have a selection pressure, sometimes also called an environmental factor. So this pressure might be a predator that's trying to eat the beetles. Equally, it could be the sun beating down on a population of gazelle, and the heat needs to be survived. Now, if there's a particular variation that is more suited to the environment that an organism is in and makes it more likely to survive, then more of those individuals will survive to adulthood, and therefore more of them will pass on their genetic information to their offspring. If we use the example of bacteria, so there are different strains of bacteria, and a lot of bacteria get replicated. And as long as some survive, then the species of bacteria will survive. That's the overproduction of offspring. There's an environmental factor here, or a selection pressure. This would be humans applying antibiotics to try and get rid of these pesky bacteria and stop ourselves being sick. Those antibiotics are going to kill some of the bacteria. Now, if, for example, some of those bacteria, one of those particular different strains, one of those variations, has randomly mutated to become antibiotic resistant, then that will give that particular strain an advantage. And if that strain has an advantage, then more of that strain will survive, more of that strain will reproduce, and therefore there'll be more of the antibiotic resistant bacteria in the next generation of bacteria. Because all the bacteria, or significant numbers of the bacteria that were vulnerable, have all been killed, basically. So heredity or inheritance then is the fact that we get that proportion of genes changing as survivors pass their genetic characteristics on to their offspring. Another example of this might be the semi-famous example of tall and short-necked giraffes. If we have tall and short-necked giraffes, then we'll have a selection pressure with really high foliage in the trees, which it's easier for the tall-necked giraffes to reach. Therefore, more tall-necked giraffes survive to pass on the genetic characteristics because they have a survival advantage, and therefore their genes will be inherited and passed on through the hereditary chain. Part 3 will deal with the types of evolution and the course of human evolution and the various evidence that we have for it. Stay tuned.